Welcome to Secret Story. It was a Saturday night and Cheryl and her husband Steve were having a party. They usually had good parties, so their house was full of friends and family. Cheryl liked parties partly because Steve was much nicer when company was around, and it was a nice break from the bickering and insults. Cheryl saw Steve's daughter Susan from a previous relationship seeking her out from across the kitchen with an angry look on her face. She needed help with her husband John. John had drunk more than he planned and had to wake up early for an overtime shift the next day but was showing no signs of slowing down. Cheryl wasn't entirely sure why this was her problem, but Susan was half drunk and Steve would obviously be no help. Cheryl rolled her eyes at the thought. Susan was a nice enough girl, but John was far too much like Steve for her taste. He was rude at the best of times and could get even meaner than Steve when he drank. More than once, Cheryl asked herself why Susan stayed with John. He made good money but not good enough to justify his temperament, or his cheating, but she usually let the thought trail off there since it was their business, she told herself. Putting John to bed was not going to be easy, but she wanted to help Susan, and since she was the only sober one between herself, Susan, and Steve, she agreed to do it. Cheryl spotted John as he stumbled out of the bathroom. She moved to intercept him before he could get another drink. He was quite tipsy at this point, so it was easy to get in front of him. Cheryl knew that John's good friend was here and that he loved to get drunk with him, so she thought up a quick lie. She told him his friend had a family emergency and left in a hurry while John was in the washroom. John was in no state to make sense of the obvious lie, and before he could respond to that with more than just curse words, Cheryl reminded him that he had to work tomorrow and that the guest room downstairs was ready for him. John gave her a curious look that Cheryl had never seen on him before, but she did not have time to think about it because John agreed and asked for her help to get downstairs to bed. As she guided John down the basement stairs, Cheryl closed the door behind them. She started to explain that he would sleep soundly since these rooms were well insulated from noise from the upper floors, but John gave her that look again, only this time there was a hunger in his eyes. Cheryl had closed the door behind her because she had planned to stay a few minutes, just to make sure that John was not going to be sick. Accordingly, she placed an empty bucket near his head. The last thing she wanted to do tomorrow was clean old puke off the bedspread and carpet. She turned to look at John, and he was taking his shirt off. He was still giving her that look, and it started to make her wonder. She turned to face the door and after another minute or two, John told her she could turn around. Cheryl turned back around and reached for the doorknob in irritated surprise, but John barked out one quick word that stopped her. No. It wasn't loud, but forceful. She not only stopped but turned back to face him. Cheryl was angry at this boldness and gave him a scolding refusal. She sounded firm and indignant, but any weight her words might have held dissipated when John caught her eyes. He smiled at her briefly before he reminded her of how long it would take for Steve and Susan to check on them. Cheryl knew this was true of her husband and stepdaughter. They would have all the privacy they would need if she wanted to go through with this. But John was her son-in-law. Despite coming to this conclusion, she took a step closer. John had gotten women to cheat on their spouses before and he knew the signs that things were going well. Cheryl's better judgment told her to leave and forget this ever happened, but it was getting harder to listen to that better judgment by the second. She walked around the edge of the bed until she stood over him. She started to see a bit of why Susan stayed with John. She lightly tugged at her hoodie zipper while she pondered this but did not really take notice. John saw that he was going to get his way. She could not believe that she was going to go through with this. John was an awful man. But she also could not deny how she felt at that moment. Oh yeah. The abrasive word gave Cheryl pause for a moment and she thought about getting up and leaving because of it but decided against it since she had already crossed a big line. She had fully given into the situation. She was content to let him insult her if she got what she wanted out of the exchange. The sound of it echoed off the room but Cheryl knew there was no chance of anyone hearing them down here over the loud music, laughter, and conversation upstairs, so she started to relax a bit more. He laughed to himself at how loud it sounded. Cheryl was a bit sore from what had happened and would still feel it the next day. She started to wonder how she managed to let this happen but pushed that thought aside. She took out a cigarette, handed it to John, and told him to smoke it to try and mask up the smell before Susan came to bed. She opened the window after she got her jeans and tank top back on. She turned to look at John as he lit the cigarette. He just smiled that somehow still hungry smile and puffed away as he chuckled softly to himself. Cheryl zipped up her hoodie and rolled her eyes at him one last time as she reached out in a silent gesture of request for him to share his cigarette. She took a long drag and handed it back before she left to rejoin the party. She told herself that this would never happen again, but part of her was worried that she had just set a precedent that could not be easily undone with a man like John. She suspected he would come back for more later, and who knew how much willpower she would have after this undoubtedly enjoyable experience. She closed the door behind her and tried not to think about it as she slipped up to the main floor. Susan came and found her once she noticed Cheryl and commented that she did not expect it to take that long to put John to bed. She expressed heartfelt gratitude for Cheryl's help. Susan was clearly drunker than when they last spoke, so any concern that Cheryl might have had of being found out vanished, but she still chose her words carefully. "Yeah, he was pretty rude, but nothing I can't handle, honey. I just wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to puke everywhere, so I stayed to watch him a bit. I need a strong drink though. You can make it up to me by getting me a vodka tonic with some lime." "I know I said I wasn't gonna drink tonight, but to hell with it." Susan smiled at her newfound exuberance and Cheryl laughed at Susan's ignorance of what occurred in the basement moments earlier. Cheryl smiled a wicked smile to herself as she watched Susan rush off to make a drink for her as thanks for what she did. Cheryl was sitting down for an evening alone in front of the television. Steve was out drinking with his friends and would not be home for hours, if at all, tonight. Cheryl had gone for a jog after dinner and was now finished with her shower and sitting on the couch deciding what kind of cocktail she wanted to prepare for the evening when she heard a truck pull into the driveway. It was too early for it to be Steve, so she was curious as she heard someone roughly open the unlocked door. Her son-in-law John barged in. He quickly slipped out of his shoes and walked over to her. "What are you doing here?" Cheryl's voice betrayed her irritation of his intrusion into her night. John said nothing and reached above her to close the curtains on the window behind the couch. Cheryl could smell that John had been drinking already. Now that he was close, she was going to scold him for driving here but got distracted by John's t-shirt. Cheryl knew there was only one reason John would show up by himself, unannounced like this. She was annoyed by his assumptions. Would it really be that bad to get bent over again tonight? Cheryl's thoughts started to make even more sense to her as John's. Once he let go of them, his heavy belt buckle took them to the floor with a loud metallic clang. Cheryl had tried to downplay how John's was in her memory ever since that night in an attempt to lessen her opinion of him. Cheryl's shock and indignation were written all over her face, and it pleased John immensely. "John. Maybe I should just kick you out," Cheryl said as she tried to muster up enough outrage to make him think she meant it. John's first response was laughter. "Okay, I'm sorry," while he spoke in a tone that wasn't at all contrite. "Now, open up." Part of her wanted to make good on her threat to kick him out and put an end to these games for good, but another part of her still fantasized about their first encounter and wanted to make a few more memories. The second part got its way. She enjoyed her slow and methodical pace, but John's impatient voice interrupted her. "Sorry, Cheryl, but I'm in a hurry." The sound would have been audible from anywhere on the main floor if anyone else was home. All the while standing in the same living room where countless family events had taken place over the years. "Here it comes, Cheryl." She saw his intentions and started to say no, but John had left her no time for negotiation. "Thanks, Cheryl. I really needed that." John spoke in a self-satisfied tone as he watched her try to wipe as much of her face clean as possible. "Happy I could help." Cheryl's words were heavy with sarcasm as she motioned for John to step back before she continued in a normal tone. "Just let me go clean my face properly and I'll be back so you can make it up to me." "Sorry, Cheryl, but I'm in a hurry. I told Mike I would be at his place 45 minutes ago. You were just on the way and I needed some relief." He spoke calmly as if he had just turned down a cup of coffee, and it angered Cheryl. Are you kidding me? The had completely left her voice as she watched him walk over to his shoes and put each of them on. What? John said with an incredulous tone, as if he had no idea why she was pissed. Like I said, Cheryl, I'm in a hurry and I gotta go. I'll see you later. He waited briefly for a response but Cheryl didn't give him one, so he opened the door and walked out to his truck. Cheryl would have been furious. Not to mention the fact that she had just finished showering before he came. While she walked to the shower she started to think that maybe a new lover would be a prudent idea. She looked over at her phone which she had placed on the bathroom counter and saw it was her daughter Joanne. She had offered to come help pick weeds from her garden but it did not surprise Cheryl to read that Joanne was bailing on that plan and had offered up a dubious excuse. She stood up and smiled at her reflection in the mirror as a naughty fantasy involving Joanne's husband started to form in her mind. She turned on the water and adjusted the temperature and waited a few moments before stepping in. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. Cheryl was sitting in her backyard gazebo waiting for her daughter Joanne to arrive. They had made plans to get together since Steve was out of town until next Tuesday on a job. The birds were out and she had been watching them with a cigarette while enjoying the weather. As she finished her smoke, she noticed a text message pop up on her phone from her daughter. Sorry, Mom. I can't make it today, something came up. Will is gonna stop by on his way home from the hardware store to pick up the roasting pan that you said I could borrow. He should be there in 10 or 15 minutes. What a surprise, Cheryl said sarcastically to herself after reading it. Cheryl had a bit of a hot and cold relationship with her daughter. She loved her dearly but there were some issues that stemmed from a bad divorce with her father that would come into play from time to time. Joanne had a habit of canceling plans between the two of them at the last minute when it suited her. The only reason Will was coming today was that Joanne needed her roasting pan for a dinner party the next day. Cheryl couldn't remember the last time she has been invited to her daughter's house for dinner. She pushed this thought aside and replaced it with something much more fun. Instead of stewing in bitterness over her daughter, some naughty thoughts of petty revenge came to her involving her son-in-law. Will. She had admired his muscular frame for years, and ever since John had pissed her off with his unexpected visit a few weeks ago. Will was her favorite son-in-law by a long shot, so it was an obvious choice for her. He was a nice guy and pretty funny when he wanted to be. He was a good man, even after having been caught a few times in this fashion, he persisted. This gave Cheryl the kernel of hope she needed. This would be a perfect opportunity to see if Will was interested in her. She looked down at the plain t-shirt and knee-length shorts she was wearing. She quickly went inside and up to her bedroom. She abandoned her baggy clothes and tossed them into a hamper. She was running short on time and she dressed herself quickly so she could get ready for Will's arrival. She gave herself one last look in the mirror. She then headed down to the kitchen to check on the coffee pot. She heard a car pull into the driveway as she came down the stairs. When she got to the kitchen she raided Steve's wheat stash. She knew Will was a big stoner so she hoped it would help convince him to stay longer than planned. She heard Will come in the front door so she called out to him in a sing-song voice. I'm in the kitchen, Will. She tried to sound happy. She didn't want to come on too strong. She just hoped it wouldn't take too much convincing. Will gave her hope on this front as soon as he entered the kitchen and noticed her tank top. His instant recognition of her choice of shirt was a good sign to Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl. Will seemed apprehensive of her when he approached and it was reflected in his tone. Joanne couldn't make it today, but she wanted me to grab that. Will was interrupted by Cheryl's exasperated guffaw. Couldn't make it. Let's not waste time with her excuses. I have a full pot of coffee and I was expecting company to help me finish it. Why not stay for a cup of coffee with your mother-in-law? Maybe we can smoke a joint as well. It's so nice out. As Cheryl mentioned the joint she leaned down over the island counter that was in between them to grab the bag of weed and rolling papers that she had purposely left on the far side of the counter. The move worked perfectly. Will helped himself and after a few drawn-out seconds, he raised his eyes to meet hers. A sheepish look came over his face as he realized he had been caught, but Cheryl's only response was a warm, satisfied smile. "I need your help, Will. I can't roll a joint to save my life. Will you stay and hang out with me for a bit?" This was a total lie on Cheryl's part. She was very good at rolling joints. Will had a conflicted look on his face. She could tell that he was on the verge of saying yes. Cheryl just needed to push him over the edge. "Joanne was expecting me back soon. I'm not sure if..." Will's half-assed objection was interrupted by Cheryl once again. "Oh, forget about Joanne. You're only here because she was too lazy to come herself. And doesn't value your time as much as her own." After 1.5 failed marriages, Cheryl had a good idea of what buttons to push to get in between a couple. She stood up straight spoke. The vocal tone of Will's response told Cheryl all she needed to hear about whether her scheming was working so far. "Okay, why not? Joanne can wait an hour or so." Will tried to sound uninterested, but Cheryl could tell he was thinking about more than just a joint and cup of coffee. Cheryl gave him a warm smile and turned around to pull 2 mugs out of the cupboard. She hoped Will's gaze, but for good measure, she made certain he couldn't avoid it when she bent over to reach the cream from the bottom of the fridge. "Steve always puts the cream so far down." She spoke in a flustered tone. Before she stood up, she turned her head back to look at him and was happy to see his eyes. "So far, so good," Cheryl thought as she stood up and poured cream into each cup before putting it back in the fridge. She told Will to grab the weed and she led him to the backyard gazebo, after filling each cup with hot coffee. Cheryl put the mugs down on a patio table and Will sat down and started to roll while Cheryl pulled her chair out and arranged it to face him. She struggled to maintain her patience as she watched Will slowly rolling a joint. His rolling skills were nowhere near as good as hers. She kept things light at first. She had always enjoyed Will's company, so it was no problem to keep the conversation going easily. Will was a warehouse manager at a small distribution company and almost always had a funny story about some workplace drama. He was finishing up a story about a new hire that had left before lunch on his second day when he finished the joint and asked about a lighter. Cheryl realized she had forgotten to bring one. Steve always kept a spare on an old bedside table that they kept out here. Cheryl stood up and walked over to retrieve it at the far side of the gazebo. She bent over at the waist again to give Will another look. She took her time finding the lighter in order to give Will a few more seconds to gawk at her. She gave him a welcoming smile as she walked back to her chair and handed the lighter to him. He arranged his chair so it faced Cheryl and they started passing the joint back and forth. Cheryl began gradually increasing the tension with a few simple compliments. Starting with his choice of shorts and t-shirt, she slowly worked her way, inch by seemingly innocent inch, towards comments about his muscular physique. Will worked out regularly and his hard, muscular frame made this obvious. He had dark hair on his head that he kept buzzed down to a short and satisfyingly coarse stubble. Cheryl didn't have to think very hard to compliment this man by any means. They puffed slowly on the joint while they sipped their coffee and talked freely. Will was the kind of guy who was tight-lipped when his wife was around, but would open up much more when she was absent. Cheryl had always enjoyed Will's company and would leave this experience with a smile on her face. She would just have a much larger smile if the former option took place. She took a big Tokay and passed it back to Will. Once her coughing fit stopped, Will spoke. "I don't think you and I have ever smoked together before, just the two of us, I mean." He coughed out a particularly big hit before continuing. "I've smoked alone with Steve a bunch of times, but this is a first for you and me, I think." He passed her the joint before coughing once more. "I usually prefer to smoke alone. But when Joanne told me you were stopping by, I knew I had to make an exception for you. A first for us, as you put it." She took a small puff and exhaled before she slipped in the rest of her sentence. "Maybe another first between us is in order." She cringed internally at such an obvious come on, but she gave him a devilish grin to better sell her off-putting statement. What do you mean?" Will looked noticeably flustered by her ambiguous, yet obvious suggestion. Cheryl interrupted him before he could get too far into that thought. She knocked the lighter on her lap onto the ground in between them. She reached down to both pick it up, and to give Will a good look down her tank top. Will, of course, took the bait and couldn't help but stare, when Cheryl grabbed the lighter and looked up at him with a smirk. When Will noticed he had been caught red-handed by Cheryl, she raised an eyebrow at him and smiled. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have looked. My eyes wander sometimes." Cheryl wasn't fooled, however. He wanted her, and she could see it in his eyes. The wheels were already turning, so she pushed a bit further as she sat up straight in her chair. "It's okay, Will. Take a good look." Cheryl was already fully committed to her plan before she said this, but there was certainly no going back now. She pushed further still to reassure him that this wasn't a trick or test. "Hers are not as big as yours are though, that's for sure." He blurted this out without thought and it was plain to see on his embarrassed face. Cheryl's ego soared at hearing this, and a wicked smile crept onto her face. She could not have hoped for a better response to her flirting. "No, they aren't." "Are they?" Cheryl's enjoyment of this was obvious as she handed the joint back to him. A few weeks ago she would have thought less of him for his behavior today, but she had since decided that real life was too complicated for a black and white mentality on moral behavior. He looked deep into Cheryl's eyes and was intimidated at first by the intimacy, but he maintained eye contact. Cheryl let the moment drag on as the gravity of their last exchange sunk in. Once it was over, she noticed their coffee cups were empty and the joint was down to a roach. "Why don't you get us more coffee while I roll us another joint?" She gave him a cheeky smile before continuing. "I may not have been entirely honest earlier, but I'm quite good at rolling." Cheryl slid her coffee mug towards him on the patio table they sat next to. "Do you know how I take my coffee?" Cheryl asked. Will chuckled at her joint-rolling confession before he stood up and responded. "Yeah, I know how you like it." He looked back over his shoulder and smiled at her as he walked away. "I'll bet you do," Cheryl said as she watched him walk away. She worked quickly and was most of the way finished before Will came back and put a cup of coffee next to her at the table. "Wow, that joint looks damn near perfect." Will was genuinely impressed with her work. "Thank you. I end up rolling most of Steve's joints for him when he drinks too much, which is a lot, as you already know." He was lost in thought for a few seconds while he pondered what else that of hers could do. Cheryl smiled as she grabbed the lighter and lit up the joint. Things seemed to be going well for her so far. "Will be in no time," she thought as she took a puff. She would have laughed out loud if not for the ensuing coughing fit. She handed Will the joint and reached for her coffee. She decided it was time to turn things up another notch. "So, tell me, Will. If I was Joanne." Cheryl smiled at him. But she was a bit worried by the long pause before his response. "Well, I wouldn't say any time. There isn't a lot of variety." Will stopped and thought carefully about whether he should continue or not. Everything has to be a certain way. She can be a bit selfish. He took a small puff and exhaled before he continued. "Sometimes she just falls asleep altogether before anything fun happens. Other times I just give up halfway through the massage and just half-ass it until I can stop." Will let out a big sigh after he was finished. Yikes. Cheryl thought as she took the joint from Will. She took a puff and tiptoed around the majority of the issues that he had mentioned. "My daughter, acting selfish? That can't be true." Cheryl's words dripped with sarcasm and Will laughed heartily at this joke, so she continued. "I love my daughter very much, but if there is one thing I have learned about her, it's that she is almost certain she knows what she wants until she stumbles across what it is she really wants. She doesn't love you because of what you do to please her. She loves you because of who you are. If you stop trying to placate her and just be yourself, she will probably respond much more favorably to you. Make your needs and wants as important to you as you make hers." Cheryl could see her words had the intended effect on Will. He just needed someone to show him his inner confidence, and Joanne didn't seem to be up to the task. Never send a girl to do a woman's job, Cheryl thought as she passed the joint and waited for Will to say something. You are probably right. I've suspected as much for a while now. Will took a puff before continuing. I just hate the thought of pushing past all the temper tantrums she is gonna have. Will was beginning to look stoned now, and it softened the tense look on his face. It will be worth the effort, trust me. She turned her head to exhale and coughed lightly. It was made to look like a careless accident. Oops, Cheryl said with a playful look on her face. She kept her fingers in place while she gauged his reaction. Whoa. He was a little shocked at how forward she was being. Listen, Cheryl. But we should stop this. The look on his face wasn't at all convincing, and even now he struggled to look her in the eyes. Hush, Will. When was the last time that Joanne took care of you properly? She is too selfish, you said so yourself. You need some relief. There was a quick, passing look in Will's eyes that implied she was correct, so she kept going. She was recycling old lines she had read in romance novels at this point, but it seemed to be working. She decided to go for it. Will. You are a good man. You don't need to worry about anything. You just sit back and let your mother-in-law take care of you. Oh. Cheryl. You are gonna get me in trouble. No trouble. Just a little secret between you and I. Cheryl handed him the lighter for the joint which had gone out of his hand. Why don't you finish that yourself? Will took one last puff and put the roach into the ashtray before leaning back. Oh, Cheryl. Was all he managed to say before he started. Wow, Will. Cheryl tossed the soiled paper towel into a nearby garbage bin. Would you like, Will? She spoke. Will said yes without a second of hesitation. Cheryl stood up and led them inside. Will. The neighbors might see. While this was a genuine concern from where they were standing, secretly Cheryl loved it and wanted another. I don't care. Will closed the door behind them. Okay, how about this? She pulled away and silently led him by the hand up the stairs. Her heart was beating fast in anticipation of what was to come. Oh, Will. How are you so good at that? She asked, somewhat rhetorically. Will paused for a few seconds and looked up at her to answer. You have your daughter to thank for that. She only gave me one chance to try on my own before she got frustrated and showed me exactly what she wanted me to do. I would like to think I learned well. He smiled at her before resuming his work. Oh, you learned very well. My thanks to Joanne, I guess. She spoke her daughter's name with a little bit more bitterness than she expected, but the thought that Joanne was at home. Did you bring the weed? She pushed herself up to look into his eyes. Will nodded and told her to look in the pocket of his shorts. She grabbed an old hardcover book from the bedside table and used the flat surface to start rolling. Cheryl had gathered her disheveled hair together and let it hang down her right shoulder. He was pulled away from the moment by the sound of his phone vibrating in his pants on the floor. Joanne had expected him home over an hour ago. He should probably check his phone, he thought, if he wanted to avoid an argument when he got home. He had fewer unread messages than he would have guessed. He gave her a generic excuse that he had been held up running errands because he bumped into an old high school friend who invited him to go out for a beer. He decided to finish it off with a half-truth. He told her that he had just arrived at her mom's house within the last 10 minutes and decided to stay for coffee and would be home later than he initially planned. They sat up in bed. Will seemed to be a bit uneasy with this unprecedented breach of his ethics, so he was making humorous small talk to keep his mind occupied with other thoughts. Cheryl had always enjoyed Will's antics when he wanted to be funny, so the two of them laughed and flirted together to keep Will's conscience at bay. Will had just taken a particularly large hit from the joint when he heard his phone go off 4 times in a row. Joanne was usually pretty fast at sending text messages when she was angry. So it didn't bode well for her acceptance of the excuse he gave for the delay. Cheryl saw the look on his face and tried to get his attention back on her. Just leave it for now, Will. She will be fine on her own for a bit longer. Will was silent. When his phone went off again he was snapped back to reality. I need to check my phone. She is gonna be pissed if I just take off all afternoon and ignore all her texts. He hadn't even read the first sentence when Cheryl interrupted him. No, Will. I'm not finished with you yet. Stop it, Cheryl. Give me a second, will you? He didn't sound at all serious in this request, so Cheryl only increased her pace while he read the messages on his phone. I'll be home when I'm home, woman. He chuckled darkly before tossing his phone onto a nearby pile of dirty clothes. Oh, Will. That's nice, Cheryl said with a hint of surprise in her voice. Will paused briefly to chuckle and respond. Your daughter likes this too. Like mother, like daughter, I guess. He laughed again before resuming where he left off. Will wiped his face on a nearby towel that had been washed and folded but not put away before joining Cheryl on the bed. She took a few minutes to collect herself before sitting up with Will. Cheryl reached over to grab the ashtray where the unfinished joint they had abandoned was waiting for them. They smoked the last of the joint in relative silence. When they got to the kitchen they exchanged goodbyes. Cheryl wanted to make plans for another time, but she didn't want to push her luck. So she wanted to keep her goodbye subtle. She almost forgot to give him the roasting pan before he left. Will poured himself a glass of water while she pulled it out of the cupboard. He drank it greedily before setting the glass down and turning around. Cheryl was bent over, facing away from him to reach the roasting pan in the cupboard. Sorry, Cheryl, but I need to have you one more time, I think. No apologies necessary, my good sir, she chuckled darkly before speaking under her breath while she watched him walk off. Well, Joanne. Maybe next time you shouldn't send your husband in your place when you don't want to see me. She started to chuckle and her laugh turned to a cackle, as she closed the door and decided to roll herself another joint.